Well, thank you so much for joining us here today. My name is Carolyn Kai Sanders. I am the CBB, or the Chief Bushel Blaster for L.U.V Enterprises, where L.U.V is an acronym that stands for Learn Your Value, using a little texting language, of course, some phonetic shortcut. I also have the absolute honor and pleasure of being the mom and student of a dynamic and charming, very intelligent and handsome young Black man named Wisdom. And so I am excited to be here with you to bring you another edition of Love Notes, where we are a thought show, not a talk show. And so I have the absolute divine pleasure to meet with two people who have been really critical, essential, who have been really a blessing to me and Wisdom in our journey here. And that's Pooja Chilukuri and Chris Furr. And they have never met each other before today. But the fact that we come from three different backgrounds, three different cultural perspectives, but I feel like we all embrace the same types of thought process. I wanted to bring us together for a short conversation. And the topic of this conversation is called The Parable Today. It's discussing a short discussion on the parable of what I call the Exceptional Samaritan. Most people are familiar with it as the Good Samaritan, found in Luke chapter 10. But I am going to take a moment to allow both Pooja and Chris to introduce themselves. And so, Ms. Pooja, if you would go first, and then Chris, if you would immediately follow her, that would be great.
Hi, thank you so much for having me part of this conversation. It's been a pleasure getting to know you as well. Hey, everybody, this is Pooja Chilukuri. I'm a nutritional therapy practitioner, a health coach, and also a published author. Most of my books are in the faith-based genre. I've published my memoir. And the thing that I'm most passionate about is all things health and wellness, whether that's physical, mental, emotional, or spiritual. And the way I go about doing that is by teaching classes and through my writing. And it's a pleasure to be here.
All right, Chris, you're up next.
All right. Yeah, my name is Chris Furr. I am the senior minister at Covenant Christian Church in Cary, North Carolina. I've been here for 6 years. Before that, I was the pastor at First Christian Church in Alexandria, Virginia for 7 years. Involved in a host of different ministry activities in and around the church, and busy leading a church through the pandemic, and live in Cary with my wife and our two boys.
Yay. Now, what's so fascinating about both Chris and Pooja is they have never invited me to church. And yet I know so much about their faith in their Savior because of their actions.
Excuse me. And that has meant a lot to me because I've met a lot of people who lead churches and this journey that me and Wisdom have been on. And so that's the reason why I brought you two together, because you haven't just talked about your faith, but you've lived it. And that has meant so much to me, because unfortunately it's absent in a lot of people that I've met. And so I just want to say thank you again for how you live your faith and have shared your faith with me because of the way you've lived your lives, not necessarily because of the things you've said. And so though I have to admit, they both have great senses of humor. And so they are great to be around for some comic relief. They are very good to laugh with. So please excuse my emotion, but I'm not afraid to share how I feel when it comes to emotions. But anyway, I want to thank you guys again for this conversation. I'm going to just take a quick moment to share an overview of the parable, just in case people aren't familiar with it. It is, and I'm gonna do it through just by briefly introducing the four characters that I think are the most important in this parable. And so the parable actually starts out as a conversation between Jesus and a lawyer.
And the lawyer is one of the main characters who I feel is important to the story, because I think he's like a lot of us who are searching for answers. Then he begins this parable where he talks about a man who fell among thieves. He was pretty much left half dead. And there were three characters that came along, and only one of them helped him. And that's where the Samaritan comes in, and why it's called the Good Samaritan, because the Samaritan helped him. So in that brief synopsis, there's the two other characters. Character 2 is the wounded man, and character 3 is the Samaritan, who I think are important to the story. Well, as the story continues, he picks him up off the ground. He takes him to this inn. He's only there with him for a night, just one night. And he leaves the next day, but he leaves him in the care of the host of the inn. And so to me, that fourth character that's of so much importance in this parable is that host, because without that host, the care of that wounded man wouldn't continue. And I think we don't take enough time to recognize how important that character is. But, and so that is where kind of my focus is on a lot when I think about the New Emancipation Proclamation project that I've been working on. And this parable is really one of the pillars, one of the three pillars that the program stands on, this project stands on. Now, the interesting thing about this parable is when it describes the Samaritan helping this man, this wounded man on the road, the word that it uses, it says he had compassion on him. And so I'd like to take the opportunity at this time to ask both Pooja and Chris, where does compassion come from? Can people develop it, or is it intrinsic to our natures? And so I just throw that out to you. I'm going to ask Chris to go first. You're a pastor. And so I'm going to ask for your take on that, just because you have so many people that you come in contact with, so much more than me and Pooja, I think. And so, and with your ministry and stuff like that, I'm sure you've seen a lot of different aspects of this. And so where does compassion come from? Can people develop it? Is it intrinsic? Tell us your thoughts.
Yeah, so the Greek word that's in the New Testament that's often translated as compassion kind of references this like stirring in your guts, like this feeling of literally, your heart sort of leaving your body, right? Like you begin to exist sort of this internal turmoil that comes within you because of what you see happening outside of you to someone else. We hear, Jesus being moved with compassion at various points, and being moved to minister to people. And I do think that that there is a certain part of human nature that lends itself to compassion. That it is intrinsic within us. We are a communal species. We live together. We belong together. We care for one another in ways that we don't see in lots of other animal species. So I do think it's intrinsic. Now, there are ways that we can certainly enrich and enhance our way of practicing compassion. And there are certainly ways in which we numb ourselves and sort of protect ourselves against feeling compassion, because we know that that compassion often, when we feel compassion, it's often a compelling feeling that compels us to act, and that can mean making our lives complicated, or making us face difficult truths, or sad situations. And so, sometimes we learn to keep our compassion in a certain place, right? I feel bad, but I'm going to feel bad in a way that allows me to keep a distance from what I see, because that turning of my guts can be so difficult, So I would say it's a yes to both of them. Yes, we're born with it. Yes, I think we have it. 99% of us have compassion, but there are all kinds of ways that we can become more compassionate and become less compassionate.
Mm. Wow, thank you. Go ahead, Ms. Pooja.
Well, I'm not sure if I can top that, but I agree. I agree like 100%. And I have worked in a classroom with little children, and it's just been very heartwarming for me to see compassion being demonstrated by 1-year-olds and 2-year-olds. So that's why, I believe that yes, it is a part of who we are. And I also agree with Chris that I don't know, whether it's society or whether it's that difficult feeling, but we may condition ourselves out of it, and sometimes we may be disconnected from that feeling, that emotion, but I think it's definitely how God made us. And we can develop it also. And again, back to the classroom, we're always teaching kids share, be nice, so we're teaching those things as a teacher or parents or society. So I think it's both. I think it's both.
Awesome. I hadn't even really considered it from that we actually teach it in some way, that it's intrinsic to our natures, but we also teach it in our interactions with children. And I have a 5-year-old, that's what we do. And I've seen him, the way he behaves towards children when we were in play group, and how he would go over to the littlest ones and pat them on their head and see how he was doing. And anytime he hears somebody crying, he wants to know, if they're being helped. He wants to be the one that goes and rescues them. And so those are great answers. And I should also clarify that by dictionary definition, compassion isn't just having that feeling of empathy towards somebody, but actually being compelled to act, which is what Pastor Chris spoke on, and as well as Pooja. They both explained it beautifully. So when we talk about compassion and we talk about this compelling need to act, do you think compassion is meeting the needs of others the way you want to meet them, or the way they feel their needs need to be met? And this could be kind of a tricky question, because sometimes we might feel that the way that we're going to meet that need might serve them better. And so, but I invite you to be honest with your thoughts, and let's talk about this. Ms. Pooja, what do you think?
And I probably, because of my personality, or it's the health coach in me, meet people where they're at and the way they want to be, the way they would want to be helped, because it is just my nature. I don't want to be imposing. I don't want to make them feel like, because when you're helping somebody, the last thing you want to do is take away their dignity. And so they need to feel power. Like, the person who is helping then becomes the powerful person in that relationship or situation. So you never want to take away somebody's power. That's just me though. But I do agree there are situations where you think, you want to do something that serves them better, and they may not know that yet. So it's tricky. It's tricky. Yes.
Wow. What a great answer. Thank you so much for that. Chris?
Yeah, I think that's very insightful. I would say my inclination is the same. And I started doing um, as a high schooler, I started doing service work, and every year, my church would take a trip to Appalachia to work on homes in Appalachia, and the founders' slogan for this program was, "We meet people right where they are, just the way they are." And so, you walk up to somebody's home and you make all these assumptions and all these judgments about, oh, house is falling down, but they have a satellite dish, and uh, you have that affluent mindset, which is really a paternalistic mindset, right? That a lot of us have to unlearn. And so for me, I'm very conscious, because I know that a lot of people who look like me um, do carry a very paternalistic worldview, even without knowing it. And surely I, don't know it all the time when I'm living that out, and don't always have the right answer. But I think that that meeting people where they are and listening to what someone is asking for and not trying to help them for what they're not asking for is important. The other thing I would say about it is you have to know when things are beyond your pay grade, is what I say. You know, some things that this person may need help with, I may not be able to help with. And you know, in the parable, you know, the exceptional Samaritan helps this person, but ultimately leaves them with someone else who has the means and the ability to provide some longer term care than what obviously the Samaritan is able to do. And so sometimes that's the case. You know, I'm a pastor. Somebody comes to me and they have, you know, a spiritual need or a crisis in in their lives, and I can counsel them. Great, but I'm also not a therapist. I'm not a psychiatrist. You know, there's certain things that they need some other help with. So I think that learning that discernment is very important. Like, you know, what am I doing here? How am I trying to help? And is this something, even though I feel compelled to help, is this something that I can really do? And that can be really hard.
Wow. Thank you both for those thought-provoking comments. And that's why Love Notes is a thought show, not just a talk show, because we might be talking, but we're going to make people think with what's being said here. And so I truly appreciate those perspectives that that kind of lay the foundation for the same concepts, just from different perspectives. And I just really appreciate you guys once again for being here. I really do. I have another question, and my question now was perfectly introduced by Chris, because he talked about the host and how after just one night of the Samaritan's care, he left him, and he left this wounded man who we don't know the status of. We know we found him half dead on the side of the road. We know he bound up his wounds and poured in oil and wine and all this other stuff to get him on the beast and bring him to this inn, stayed with him for a night. We don't know if he was in a coma, if he woke up. We don't know if the Samaritan ever spoke with him or anything else like that. We just know that whoever he left him with, he trusted to take care of him, and even committed funds for his further care when he was able to return, whenever that was, because we don't know where he was going or where he was coming from, you know? And that's what I love about this parable too, is that there's so many questions that need to be answered, that beg to be answered, but they're not important technically. You know, all the information we need is in the parable, and that's why Jesus told it the way he did. And so going back to where Chris was talking about, he said, sometimes we need to recognize where, you know, we're dealing with something that we can handle. And so what is the importance of community? Is the importance of community the same today and achieving the long-term goals of the Samaritan to those who are wounded? If so, why? And how can we as people help others to achieve that community, to be able to be completely healed from the wounds that they've endured? So I think I'm going to throw this one back at you, Chris, since you so graciously and wonderfully introduced it.
Maybe the segue, huh? Yeah. So I think that community is vitally important, you know, and you know, you said at the beginning that, you know, that I haven't invited people to church. I invited you to church, which is true. Yeah, because, you know, I'm very mindful of that same paternalism type of thing. But when I speak to people about church, that's what I talk about as community. And you need a community. All of us need a community of people around us. And some of us call it a church, and some of us call it other things, you know. So you know, some of us may go to a mosque, some of us may go to a temple, some of us may go to a gym, you know. So, you know, it takes different forms for different people. But that community is so vitally important, because just as much as you may be called on to show compassion and kindness to someone else, there's also going to be a moment when you are going to be in need of that compassion from someone else. So having those long-term relationships, I think, are so important. The other thing I think we've seen in these last almost a year now is how much sense of community we've lost in our country. Predominantly because we don't see each other. I mean, when I say see, I mean like really see, not just look, but see one another and see one another's needs and see one another's identities and see one another's pain and hopes and dreams. And you know, if you look around the country, around the world, at countries that have handled the COVID-19 pandemic with more success, it's because they have more communal cultures as rather than more individualistic cultures. They have a greater sense that they belong to one another. I read somebody say like the worst thing we did was to tell Americans that you wear a mask to protect someone else and not to protect yourself, because then we didn't see which is an indictment, I think, of our culture, and lots of things feed into that, our isolation, our addictions to technology, all of those things. But you need to have a sense of community. In other words, having your bubble that exists all the time, not just in pandemic times, but then also a broader sense of belonging to one another. That even the person I see on the street, or the person that I see who has a different bumper sticker than I did for their candidate, like all of us have a communal responsibility to one another. And when that breaks down, you see the concurrent pandemics. You see the pandemic of racial justice, you see the injustice, you see the pandemic of COVID-19, you see the pandemic of economic hardship. All of those things come together because we don't have a sense that that we are only as good or only as healthy a culture as the ones in our community who are struggling the most.
Right.
So that sense of community is just vitally important.
Wow. It's like we're only as strong as our weakest link type mentality. Miss Pooja, please.
Everything Chris said, I completely agree. It resonates. And I just want to add, it's the whole thing about it takes a village, right? There's a reason why that saying has come from. And I grew up with a very strong sense of community in India. And that was the hardest thing I had to adjust when I first came to the US, was the more individualistic types of, mindset. We didn't even knock on each other's doors back home. You could just walk into somebody's room if that was family. And so the first thing when I came here, I had to learn how to knock, which is kind of funny, but again, it's so the thing about community too is because even if I want to help someone, I am limited as a person, right? I may not be able to help them in all the aspects, but in community, we can find all of those different aspects and help someone in a more holistic way, I feel. So definitely very important.
I feel so uplifted by this conversation. Thank you guys. Thank you both so much for the ways that you have, for the energy and for the comments that you have brought to this conversation. It has been just what God ordered, because that's who put it together. I was like, wow, okay, whatever you say. And so I just want to thank you again. Such mighty, mighty ideas for us to consider. And just this concept of seeing each other. It's not about, vision, because we could be blind and, and not have that ability to visually see somebody, but we are spiritually blind and are mentally blind towards one another nowadays, it seems, where we're not able to see one another any longer as people, that we've lost our humanity towards one another. And so I really appreciate I really appreciate that. And once we do, we can then work on this holistic aspect of reaching out, but really it has to start with ourselves, right? We have to have that, be able to see ourselves in the mirrors. And sometimes, you know, a lot of people are looking in the mirror and not liking what they see, so they can't perpetuate that on somebody else. And so that's interesting because it kind of goes along with the post that you were saying about loving yourself on your wellness page today, Miss Pooja.
Yes, I've always said, you know, when Jesus said, love your neighbor as yourself, I said, well, why doesn't anybody teach us about loving ourselves? He said, love them as yourselves. So that was just what came up for me this day.
That's awesome. And that's interesting because I've said that too. I said that commandment doesn't have two parts. It actually has three. It says love God and love your neighbor as yourself. So it's actually love God, love yourself, and then love your neighbor as yourself. It's not a two-part commandment. It's three. And so that's why when I saw that, I was like, oh my gosh. Another way for that we connect. Okay.
Yes.
So we are coming to the end of our conversation, but I do want to ask of you to share your thoughts on if there was one thing that you could do, you can wave a magic wand or whatever to change the current dynamics in society for someone who may be wounded on the road, what would you do? And Miss Pooja, I'm going to invite you to start our conversation, start our conclusion by answering.
If I could wave a wand, what I would want is for somehow society to develop this mindset. Let's not question whether someone deserves something. If there is a need, let's just be ready with that compassion, you know. Let's not have that question and that judgment. Because that's been, yeah, on my heart. Yeah.
Wow. Powerful. Chris, it's on you now.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I'm so glad you said that because this is again that paternalistic mindset, right? Like I need to make sure that this person is deserving of what I'm about to give them. And when I hear that, I often think, I often will ask people, well, what do you think would have happened if Jesus had asked that question? Where would you be if you only got what you deserved? And that would sometimes check people. So you know uh, that part of understanding that that's really what grace is, right? That it doesn't, and part of what giving is, and feeling compassion. Um, you know, it's not for me to know what's going to happen to the $5 I hand out my window. I don't need to know that. I just need to know that I need to have the kind of heart that is willing to part with my $5. So the other thing that I would say is uh, one of the things that uh, I think is important that I've preached on before when I've preached on this passage is the lawyer at the beginning who asked this question, and he's really asking, who is my neighbor? And I think what he's saying is, what he's really looking for is, whose needs can I ignore? Like, where does the boundary stop where I don't, okay, well, your neighbor is the person who lives proximate to you, or your neighbor is within a 5-mile radius, or, so what is the limit to my compassion? When am I off the hook? And Jesus, like Jesus tends to do, turns the question around, because he doesn't give him an answer like that, because he tells the parable and then he says, which one of these was a neighbor to the man who was hurt? And so what he says is, the question isn't, who is my neighbor? The question is, what kind of neighbor are you? And so that part of it is, I think what I would have people to think about is to stop looking for that place where you can switch it off and still sleep at night, to where you can, say that's not my problem, sort of, so to speak. Um, that that your neighbor is whatever is right in front of you. And if you again go back to that vision thing, if you have eyes to see and listen and really hear someone, you will be able to discern who your neighbor is. You just have to decide what kind of neighbor you want to be. And I think we have, back to what we said before, we just have too many folks who are looking for answers like that lawyer. Okay, when have I done enough? When is it enough? When have we given too much? Sort of, so to speak. And that's just not a healthy way for us to live together.
Wow. Woo! I was getting emotional over here between the two of you, because I have been contemplating the mission. And I had recently heard a TED Talk, and one of the in the TED Talk, the person who spoke had spoken about to create a mantra versus a personal mission statement. I've written so many things about all the projects that I want to do, and I barely remember what I wrote about them. But there are two things that I remember about L.U.V. Enterprises, is that L.U.V. Enterprises is about building the village and raising the child. And as an offshoot of that, the New Emancipation Proclamation Project is about bringing dignity to poverty. And that means giving people the option of choice and empowering people with greater options to choose the types of lives and the environments they want to be in, instead of having to be limited by what they can afford, basically. And so just the things that you have been speaking on has resonated with me, because it's exactly what I feel needs to happen in the world, and why God put me in where we're at right now, to be able to experience other people who are like-minded. And the reason why I said that neither one of you have ever invited me to church, and neither has the person that introduced me to Chris either. So they're members of his church. They didn't invite me either, but their lives, once again, I don't think the person that we're associated with, Pooja, invited me to her church either, so it's okay. But through your lives, you have shown what God looks like, and I think that I know that this conversation has definitely spoke to how God can look in our own lives, especially in a time such as this. And so there was one thing in the last part of what Chris spoke about that I just want to throw out really quickly. In the way the parable ends is very fascinating to me, because I feel that when people hear the charge to go and do thou likewise, because after, as Chris mentioned, Jesus asked him, which of these is, was the neighbor to him who fell among thieves? And the lawyer says, him who showed mercy. And Jesus said, go and do thou likewise. And so I think people get caught up with this concept that it's mercy that we're supposed to be extending. And I was like, I got this impression that we were actually supposed to go and do what Christ said to do. And that's bind up people's wounds, pour in that oil, get them off the road, and help them by bringing a community around them so that their healing can be full and complete. And so it's just been interesting how all those things, and the ways that you have answered the questions, you have built the parable of the Samaritan to represent, this conversation has solidified the importance of the parable of the Samaritan, that the parable of the Samaritan, this exceptional Samaritan in its entirety, is what's important, not just extending mercy, because mercy can be something that lasts for just a moment and people forget that they were extended it, where true mercy really lifts a person in a way that they can then lift others. And so I want to ask you, just for speculation's sake, what do you think happened to the wounded man? Chris, what do you think happened to him?
Well, one of the interesting things that's always fun to ask about stories like this is, how do we get to know this story? Like, obviously Jesus told it, but you know, how do stories like this get told? Because even though this is a parable and quote unquote a fictional story, we all know stories like this of real life things that happen. And so how do those stories get told? They become testimonies. They become somebody's story, and that person then becomes the one who is able to testify to the mercy that they have received. And it goes back to what Pooja was talking about, being able to just being able to love yourself is important, and being able to love someone else. And I think people who are unwilling to or unable to show mercy to others tend to be people who can't accept that mercy is true for themselves. And so, but when you have received the grace and mercy of Christ, you truly received it. The natural outpouring of that is for other people to receive it as well. And so, to me, I think probably the wounded man became, someone who testified, who shared, what it was like, paid it forward, and learned, how to practice that compassion for someone else. I would also like to think that somebody stopped to ask, well, what's going on that people are getting beat up and left on the side of the road? What's happening in this neighborhood? Like, and robbed them. What are their needs? Why are they in this position where this is something that they feel they need to do? So it's not just addressing that crucial wound, that immediate wound, but all right, let's look below and see about the conditions that made this happen. And maybe that was part of the unpacking too. Let's see what's happening underneath the surface here, to see how, what's broken here that needs to be healed still.
Right. Thank you. Ms. Pooja, what do you think happened to that wounded man?
Oh, that was powerful though, Chris. Thank you. Yeah.
Seriously.
Trying to figure out, right, why he was beaten and robbed in the first place. I was still thinking about that. What do I think happened? One little detail in there that always struck me, even when I read it a long time ago, is wasn't this guy, so this guy was the Samaritan, but does it say whether the wounded person was Jewish? I always assumed he was, but because I know that back in those days, they didn't used to have very good, or they had their prejudices against each other, right? Those two communities. So I always wondered that him having received help like that from the Samaritan, if that broke his prejudice down, that if he would see him in a different light.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, because sometimes, when we build up stereotypes and we have prejudices against certain peoples and races, and then when we receive kindness from those people, it just, you just have to wrestle with that. It creates that friction against that stereotype, right?
Yeah.
So kindness goes in all directions, I think. So maybe the healing, I'm sure he was healed. I also wondered if he ever tried to get in touch with that person, because back in the day, they didn't have even the means, right?
Right. I've questioned that too. That's interesting that you bring up those points, because it is something to wonder if he got up. The story doesn't identify him. The only definite characteristics of the wounded man, there's one word that describes the lawyer, the wounded man, and the Samaritan. And that in the King James Version, it's certain. Certain. That's the word that describes the lawyer, the wounded man, and the Samaritan. And I always thought that was fascinating. And I asked God about that. And when I looked it up, it meant they were sure and they were without doubt. And so for me, the lawyer was certain that he could get away with twisting the questions around to get what he needed out of the answers. And then the certain man was certain that he was going to get from Jerusalem to Jericho, where he was traveling to. And then the Samaritan, he was certain about whatever direction he was going to as well. And the way that I've seen this parable is that it's a reflection of every person, because we are all on the road from Jerusalem to Jericho. Once we get here, we are trying to get back home. That's what I tell people. Where are you from? Heaven. I'm just trying to get back home. Take as many people with me as I can. Okay. I tell people all the time, like, are you an angel? I said, oh no, I'm not. I can't even claim that. I'm just trying to get back to my daddy. Okay. And so, but I think this is the journey that everyone takes. And I think it's really, that Chris brings up several good points as well about how, that, it's a testimony. And I often wonder if Christ was telling the story, a true story. We just call it a parable, but it was a true story that actually happened, and he was relating it because he also knew that it was a reflection of the life that he lived, and what would happen if people came to him and brought their wounds and that he's been seeking people. And when they turn and find him, that they will be healed and they will be taken from the road that they've been traveling and put in the right way that they need to go. And so thank you both. It's been a great conversation. I am so excited for further ones and to see where our roads continue to connect. Any final thoughts? Ms. Pooja, is there anything that you want to share with the people? Anything that's pressing on your spirit?
Well, it's been pressing on my spirit for days. I don't even know if it has anything to do with our conversation,
Will you
but
share it?
I just really feel that, like you said, we're here on planet Earth and it's a journey. And the journey begins, and when we start this journey, I think wounds are just part of life. Like, we can inflict wound on others knowingly or unknowingly, and then others, the same thing, we also on the receiving end. And I really believe that Jesus is really, really and truly cares about our healing. So sometimes just being a part of somebody's healing doesn't mean that we have incredible gifts of healing or we can help them with everything they want. Sometimes just letting people know that you see them can be very healing. So even a smile or an acknowledgement, because I agree with what you said earlier, Kai. I feel like in some ways we're losing that touch, the human connection. And so just to be mindful that a smile, a nod, some sort of an acknowledgement can go a long way, and it could be part of someone's healing journey. I see you. That's my thing. I see you,
Yes. Thank you. It is absolutely relevant. Chris, any final thoughts from you?
Yeah, I'll just echo that. I mean, I think all of us are going. I mean, this pandemic is ongoing trauma, right? It's that we're all going through and experiencing in different ways, and so that showing that compassion to one another and to ourselves is important, and recognizing that sometimes the feelings we have of wanting to care for other people, and we've seen so many stories of so much pain and brokenness, and you want to fix it all. You want to fix it all, but but the reality is none of us can undo this trauma. None of us can bring anybody's loved one back. We can't bring anybody's business back. All of that stuff. And sometimes the best thing we can do for someone else is just to sit with them, in whatever it is they're going through, and resist the temptation to fix it. And then maybe the compassionate thing is to just sit with them and practice that I see you, and not have to be the one fixes it. Sometimes it's hard for us, but I think lots of times that's all people need. It's just to feel like they're not alone.
Woo. Amen. Amen. Thank you two so much
Amen.
thank you two so much for your compassion and for your vision that you do see people, and not just see people physically, but you honor who they are and their past, because that's one of the things that I have never felt from either one of you, and that was judgment. I've always felt just genuine friendship and love from the first time I met you guys under two totally different circumstances. And it has been such a pleasure to feel that, and to call you not just friends, but brothers and sisters in Christ, you know, because of how you have lived and the examples that you have shown. Now, I didn't know, I just think it's funny because they've never invited me to church. I have been to Chris's church only because I looked it up. And so I have seen him preach. And I know a little bit more about Pooja because I have her book and I've read it. And that is something that is, I think it was really interesting that you brought up the word trauma, Chris, because I don't think people realize that that's what we're going through collectively, is trauma. And that trauma could be on top of all the other traumas that we have yet to be healed from. You know, it's just another thing that we're inflicted by. And so my journey with Pooja has been that she opened the door for me to heal from a spiritual trauma that I had been through that I hadn't acknowledged. And so I just appreciate you both for your insight and for your wisdom, and for just being a part of me and Wisdom's path, because you guys have both been a blessing in ways that are untold, and that God knows, and he continues to bless you because of, I know that. And I'm just going to say thank you so much for where this will lead, because I think it will touch people and it will cause people to think and maybe to choose to do something different than they've done before, that we don't have to stick by what we've always done, that maybe we will take that opportunity to heal from our own traumas. And even if we don't feel like we were being seen, that we can turn around and we can look at somebody and see them, regardless of what their path is, regardless of what their belief is or anything else like that. And that we will love, love. Like I said, Love Enterprises stands for learn your value, but it's just as important that when you learn your value, that you can recognize somebody else's, and you can honor it and respect it and reverence it, and help them to see who they are as well, not just in the world, but in the eyes of God, most especially as his child, and how precious he is to them. They are to him. And so I just want to say thank you for joining us for this amazing edition of Love Notes, this relaunch edition of Love Notes, discussing the parable today, the parable of the Exceptional Samaritan. And I look forward to you guys, your comments in the chat, or not in the chat, but your comments and any feedback that you might have, or any thoughts that you have about what you heard today. And for the next time, until then, it is continue to remember that it's another amazing day in paradise. And I hope you all enjoy creating it. Thank you so much.